Hi y'all. So I'm super excited about this cooking demo. I mean, I'm always excited to be in the kitchen, but even more so right now. And the reason why is because I love chilly weather. Not to say that it's really been that cold, but you know, a little bit of chill the past couple of days has got me wanting a really nice, rich, creamy soup. So with today's lab and us talking about milk and milk products, one of my favorite ways of incorporating dairy into cooking is by making a roux, because you're using butter and you're using milk. But there's also alternatives. With that being said, today we're going to use butter and milk. And anyway, so I'm really excited about this because the one thing about roux is that it's the base for 4 out of 5 of the mother sauces. And the mother sauces are the base of some of the most popular sauces that came out of France. And today I'm wearing my chef coat that I had for when I went to culinary school at Le Cordon Bleu, or Le Cordon Bleu. Sorry, I had to be a little nerd for a second. Anyway, so there's several different ways of making your soup super creamy. But again, for the purpose of this lab, I'm gonna make it my favorite way, which is a roux. And we did it so much in culinary school and it was always my favorite. Anyway, so what exactly is a roux? So it is a smooth paste that is made from flour being fried in fat. That's a lot of F's. And it is then added to soups and sauces and gravies to make them thick, smooth, and rich. Clearly, I'm very excited about doing this because I can't get my words out. So exactly where did it come from? Like I mentioned that it came from French culture. So the invention of this technique of making a roux came from the 17th century when the Sun King was a true revolutionary in France and also in European cuisine. And so, like I mentioned earlier, that 4 out of 5 of these mother sauces are based off of a roux. So French colonists, when they came to America a century later, they took the roux and they added an element to it. So it is always white and blonde is kind of, I always call it a blonde roux, but it's technically a white roux. But they added components where if you cook the butter, if you fry the flour in the butter for longer periods of time, you start to change the components of the roux. It goes from a white blonde all the way down to a dark brown. And so by taking it all the way to the opposite end, that's where Cajun cuisine came in. And so giving it that deep, nutty richness that really adds to that aesthetic of Cajun cuisine. So exactly how is it made? So like I mentioned, that with French cuisine, you utilize that butter by melting down the fat. For us, it'll be butter. Melting down the fat, adding the flour, frying it in there, and then adding a milk or a stock component. But in Cajun cuisine, the roux is not made with butter. Why? We went over this last week. Because it has a low melting point. And so they use oil, lard, and mostly it's bacon grease that are always favored because one, it gives it that rich color that they want and it doesn't burn as easily. So generally traditional, you do equal parts fat and flour. Also, little side note. So today we're going to be making a soup, right? So with that, I want to give you a little life hack. So, you know, sometimes you don't always either one, have the money, or two, know how to make a soup from scratch, or don't really have the time, don't really want to. So buying a can of soup at the grocery store is always the fastest. It's always the easiest. But sometimes it's not as creamy, as thick as you really want it. So, life hack. You can make a roux really fast, add it to a store-bought soup, and then give it that rich creaminess that you're looking for. So, life hack for me. So I am heating my pan right now. Just a little bit. You don't want it too high because you don't want to burn the butter. So here I have my butter cubed. And the reason why I do this is because we want an even melt. You don't want to put just a pat of butter or a big chunk of butter because it's not going to melt evenly. So some parts are going to have a chemical reaction that makes it brown a lot faster than others. So we're going to go ahead and put that in there. I have a nice stainless steel whisk. And because I'm using a nonstick pan here, you don't want to whisk rigorously. You don't want to really touch the bottom. You don't want to scrape it. So it's kind of just a little light. And I'm just moving the butter around right now to kind of get it to melt a little bit faster. So while it's doing that, I'm gonna go ahead and heat up just a tiny bit more. It's almost there. So I have my butter here. I'm gonna be adding my flour here shortly. Just kind of add a little bit at a time because it's, like I mentioned, that it's 1-to-1 ratio. But since I'm only making a small batch of soup that I have already, it's actually store-bought. So it's coming from a can, so a can always has 2 servings. And so it's one of my favorite soups that if I just don't really have the resources, especially right now with everything going on at the grocery store and not having a whole lot of products, I usually just buy canned soup, and then I like to call it semi-homemade because it's something that I'm purchasing, but then I go in and whip it up a little bit more to make it more my own. So the butter is melted, so I'm gonna start adding in my flour. You want a nice little paste, so I know that sounds a little rigorous, but you can see how that's coming together. It's actually perfect. You don't want it too thick. And you can just smell, like if you really go based off the smell, you can smell the butter. You can smell that it's cooking, smell that chemical reaction happening. You don't want to smell the flour. That's when you know that you have used too much flour. So like I mentioned, so you're going to heat up that butter at a low heat, stirring the flour until that paste forms. This is a little bit on the looser side because the soup that I'm using, it's a little loose, but it's not too loose. So for the purpose of this soup, I'm not going to make it too pasty. So from here, the length of cooking time just kind of depends on the darkness of roux that you're looking for, and thus the flour of the final product. So we're going to be making this white blonde, which is already what I've made. This type of roux here is generally used for bechamel sauce. A bechamel sauce is the base that you can make for white gravy that goes with, biscuits and gravy, or for a cheese sauce for mac and cheese. It's just cooked long enough to eliminate that taste of raw flour. And then for a roux for like sauce espagnole, it's brown to like a light tan. It's known, and then for Cajun and Creole dishes, it's a dark chocolate brown. It's very, very dark, very dense in color, very dense in color, and can easily end up charred in the hands of an inexperienced cook. So it's just, just kind of monitor over time. And that's okay. Like, we learn by making mistakes, right? Even in culinary school, I made enough mistakes. So I'm going to start slowly adding in my milk. You don't want to add too much. And another reason why we use it, or we cook this at a low heat, not only do we not want the butter to burn, but we also don't want to scorch the milk. That gives it a very off flavor. You can smell it and you can taste it. We're just getting it a little bit too. So I don't know if you've ever had cream of wheat, but this is kind of what you're looking for. You want it to be just thick enough, but still also kind of loose. So you start with a paste, and then you start to loosen it up with that milk. And about this time, I would normally add the salt. But because I'm using store-bought soup that already has, you know, its own seasonings, I like putting it in there first and getting it to the right consistency that I look for, and then see if I need to add any more salt. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in my soup. I may have to add in a little bit more milk, but we'll see. It looks like it's a nice little consistency. So at this point, once we start to mix, what you want to do is you want to bring it up to a boil. It's in that point where you start to boil that it starts to come together. So why does it do that? So two things happen. As we've gone over several times, I'm turning up the heat a little bit. So as we've talked about a lot when it comes to starch, which flour is, the starch molecules, once it comes in contact with the milk or stock, it absorbs that water and it starts to swell. And it really happens a lot when you are in that boiling phase. And so it absorbs it, swells up. That's what thickens the sauce. So a lot of times you can even play with this. You can play around with this. You can try and get it to thicken at a lower temperature. And see, right now it's still kind of loose, right? I mean, it's a little bit thicker than it was before. But as you start to turn up that heat and you start to get closer to that boil, you will notice that it starts to thicken a lot better. And a lot of times what you do if you're making a soup and you don't make a roux and you want it to thicken and you add flour, what you do is you bring that liquid up to a boil first. Then you take with a spatula, with a soup ladle, you take some soup, put it in a separate bowl with the flour and slowly whisk it in so you can get that part thickened and then put it back in the soup, and that's what you're gonna use as a base. If you don't do that, what happens is the base starts to clump and the flour starts to clump and it doesn't quite thicken the way that you want it to. So I'm gonna turn it up a little bit more and just kind of like leave it for a second. So when we fry that flour, it helps to keep the individual particles separated by a coating of fat. So it's the same thing when you're making biscuits. So you have the flour and then you start to incorporate the butter. The chunkier the butter, the more layers that you're gonna have. So now it's starting to bubble, starting to boil. And when that water is added, like I mentioned, that starch molecules start to swell, and that aids in the constant. And that's why we stir as it happens. So we're agitating the starch molecules and help give it that smooth consistency that we look for. And that right there, that is a proper thickness that I look for. Oh, it smells so good. I hope that you enjoyed this cooking demo, and I will see y'all next week.